Ever told yourself, yeah, I could totally rock climb that cliff,
Mm-hmm.
only to freeze like 5 feet up?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe it's that presentation you knew you could totally wing.
Mm.
Yeah, ego. Am I right?
It's a sneak you are.
Speaking of, you've brought us a fascinating deep dive today, this whole idea of ego.
Yes.
We've got excerpts from a podcast called Beyond the Ego to help us unpack it all.
Very appropriate.
So ready to untangle this thing.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we're doing this one.
Hmm.
The podcast we're looking at, it starts with a definition that really clicked for me. Describing the ego as that mediator, right? Between our inner world, all our thoughts and feelings, and the outside world.
So how we present ourselves to everyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's that sense of we all have.
Okay, so maybe not evil incarnate then.
Right.
Like some people might think
Yeah.
more like what? Our own personal PR manager.
Exactly. And that's such a good way to put it. Because, like a good PR manager, the ego helps us navigate reality. It helps us make decisions, build a sense of self.
But it can get a little overzealous.
Oh, absolutely. It can get a little,
Yeah.
over the top, exaggerating our importance.
There it is.
And that's where the trouble starts, right?
That's where the trouble starts. Now, you mentioning this whole inner world, outer world thing,
Yeah.
it reminds me of something I read about Freud.
Of course.
His theory of the id, ego, and superego.
Yes,
Any relation there?
definitely. This whole thing is about balance, right? Like Freud was getting at.
Right.
So picture this. You walk past a bakery
Okay, I like where this is going.
and your id, that primal part of you,
Yeah.
it's screaming for a donut, right?
Give me the sugar.
But then your superego, your conscience.
Oh, no.
It's all like, think of your summer bod goals. We're getting back in shape.
Right, gotta get that beach bod ready.
Exactly. So, who has to step in and make the call? The ego.
The negotiator.
Exactly.
So it's that inner battle we all feel. Donut versus beach body. But where does a healthy ego fit into all of this?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The podcast really emphasizes that it's not about,
Yeah.
eradicating the ego completely.
Right.
It's more about finding that sweet spot, that balance.
Adoration.
Yes. A healthy ego is what fuels our confidence. It's what helps us set boundaries. It
Right.
motivates us to actually achieve our goals.
So it's that difference between like knowing you ace that presentation because you put in the work
Yes.
versus eating everyone in the room to like shower you with praise. Right.
Exactly. And, to illustrate how easily we can get tripped up by our ego,
Okay.
the podcast host, they gave this really relatable example.
Yippee.
Have you ever needed help with something but didn't want to ask? Because, you didn't want to seem weak.
Oh, all the time.
Right. That I can do it all myself.
Yeah.
Mentality.
Yeah.
It often backfires, and that's the ego right there.
Oh, absolutely. And it feels like that's even more prevalent now
Totally.
in the age of social media.
Oh, 100%. And the podcast even talks about that.
All right.
How social media can be like a breeding ground for ego inflation.
Right. Because it's all about presenting this like curated version of ourselves.
Exactly. We craft these online personas, often, slightly exaggerated versions of ourselves,
Right.
and then we get hooked on the validation,
The likes.
the comments.
Steady drugs.
It is. It's like this instant gratification, right?
Yeah.
But it's fleeting, and then we just want more and more.
More. Always chasing that high.
Exactly. It's like a sugar rush.
It is a sugar rush.
That leaves you
Crashing hard afterwards.
Yeah. Speaking of,
Yeah.
trying to manage or control these urges,
Right.
the podcast, they offered some really intriguing tactics for, sort of managing our ego.
Right.
And one that stuck out to me was mindfulness.
Mindfulness. Yeah.
What was your take on that?
I love the idea of catching the ego in action, like it's this little gremlin on your shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they actually gave this technique in the podcast, this idea of labeling your thoughts
Yeah.
as you have them, like, oh, is that my ego talking? Or is that, really me?
Oh, I like that.
And that awareness alone, that labeling, can help us choose how we respond.
So we're not just reacting.
Exactly.
We're taking a second.
Yes. You're not just on autopilot anymore. You're like, wait a minute, I have a choice here.
I love that. And another thing they talked about, gratitude,
Oh, gratitude is huge.
as kind of an antidote to this ego problem.
And I thought that was so brilliant because, gratitude really shifts our focus.
How so?
It takes us from me, this very egocentric place to we.
So it's outward focused.
It is. It's about connecting with something larger than ourselves,
Right.
appreciating the good, acknowledging, the contributions of others.
It's hard to be, like, stuck in your own head
Totally.
when you're thinking about all that good stuff.
It's true. It really helps you get out of your own way.
You know, it's funny because the podcast really focused on managing the ego.
It did.
But it got me thinking, what if the ego itself isn't inherently a bad thing?
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Didn't it, like, evolve for a reason? You know what I mean? Like, to
Yeah.
help us.
To help us survive, maybe even thrive.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, maybe a healthy ego, of course, balanced with empathy, with self-awareness.
Right.
Maybe that was actually essential for our ancestors to survive, to
Right.
push them, to innovate, to lead.
To protect their own.
Exactly. I mean, it's definitely something to ponder.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it?
I hadn't thought about it that way before.
I know it's a good reminder that, these things are often more nuanced than we think.
So, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here,
Yeah.
what's, like, one key takeaway for our listeners out there?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that a little self-awareness goes a long way.
Self-awareness for sure.
Yeah, pay attention to your ego. See if it's actually serving you or if it's holding you back.
Right.
Because, like we were discussing, a balanced ego, it can be a really powerful tool
Absolutely.
for a more fulfilling life.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to go do some more thinking about all this.
Me too.
But for now,
Yeah.
we're going to wrap it up here. But as always,
Yes.
thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure, as always.
And we'll see you next time.